So it turns out George Miller's 3,000 Years of Longing is not about the wait between the third and fourth Mad Max movie. 4 of George Miller's 11 feature films are about Mad Max and 2 are about dancing penguins, and yet he still manages to be one of the most eclectic directors working. Fresh on the heels of the kinetic Mad Max Fury Road comes a more talky, introspective project on the nature of loving and longing before he returns to the wasteland. Let's see what he packed into the eon-spanning love story. 3,000 Years of Longing is based on the short story The Djinn and the Nightingale by author A.S. Byatt, but like any adaptation, it went through a few changes. One of those is the name of our lead narratologist. Turns out a narratologist is someone who spends a lot of time studying the way stories are told and how those stories shape human perception, which honestly sounds like a really cool job. In the short story, our story expert is Gillian Perholt, but for the movie she gets a name more evocative of the role she'll be playing, Alithea. Alithea is a variation of Alethea, or the Greek goddess of truth. They had to have a whole goddess for that because the other gods were not into the concept at all. This isn't just that she represents the truths of the stories that we tell, but presumably she sees the truth within the Djinn stories, even if she doesn't get it right on the first try. Byatt's The Djinn and the Nightingale is not only a short story about a djinn and a narratologist trading stories, but also the title of a collection of short stories that are all inspired or crafted in the manner of fables and mythologies. One of the influences that is front and center is a collection of short stories within a story, 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights. In that story, Shahrazad is brought before the Sultan, and she starts to tell him stories to prevent him from executing her. You know, that's one way to get over writer's block. There's a quirk in filmmaking where if a trademark company appears in a movie, they paid for it. But if they didn't pay for it, the movie isn't allowed to use their trademark. Yeah, it's a weird thing almost certainly dreamed up by lawyers. That means that movies will create fictional companies to fill in for real companies. That's also a great place to make a nod here or there. For 3,000 Years of Longing, that nod comes by naming the fictional airline that comes into play a few times after the famous storyteller Shahrazad as Shahrazad Airlines. Perhaps more than any other subgenre, comic book movies have a massive graveyard of things that could have been. Sam Raimi's never realized Spider-Man 4. Kevin Smith, then Tim Burton's Superman that at one point included Superman superfan Nick Cage, and that was one of 3 proposed Superman movies that eventually resulted in Superman Returns. Another was proposed by J.J. Abrams, and the other was the first go at Batman vs. Superman. There is even a Batman Year One with the script adapted from the original author Frank Miller and set to be directed by Darren Aronofsky. Perhaps one of the more disappointing things that could have been was when Miller was tapped to create a Justice League movie. The studio ultimately went with Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. In a nod to Miller's never realized Justice League, when Alithea gives her presentation on narratives, you can see a cover for a Justice League comic book. While Miller may have had his eyes set on DC, his 2 central actors have been making their mark on Marvel as of late. One of the only Asgardians to appear in all 4 Thor movies, Heimdall is Asgard's gatekeeper. Even being dead didn't keep him out of Love and Thunder, as he welcomed one last soul to where they were going by guiding Jane Foster to Valhalla. On the subject of the Sanctum Sanctorum, its previous keeper makes up the other half of our movie's heroes. Before there is Doctor Strange and Wong, well, before a lot of people given her name, Tilda Swinton played the Ancient One. In a nod to the actor's roles in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the cover to a Marvel comic is also displayed in her World of Narratives presentation. 3 comes up a lot in general. It is the magic number after all. Modern movies by and large are considered to have 3 acts. There's also the rule of 3s in comedy, which is just a limit on how many times you can go back to a joke. The title itself has its own 3 in it, with the longing being 3,000 years long. Genies famously dole out 3 wishes as long as the person that freed them is not an expert on stories and knows that there isn't one story about wishes that isn't a cautionary tale. The background features a number of 3s, some more subtle than others, like a graffiti of an Arabic 3 on the train. Alithea stays in room 333, the Djinn tells 3 stories, and will eventually visit Alithea every 3 years after being set free. Books inevitably change as they make the transition from one medium to another. Sometimes it's a product of time constraints or the weaknesses and strengths of the different mediums. Sometimes it's just a matter of what the person doing the adaptation feels is important when it comes to the story. Even though the story it's based on is a short story, there are still some changes from the book. Chief among them is Alithea's approach to wishing. Both Alithea and her literary counterpart are wary of the prospect of wishing for the same reason. They are experts in narratives, and there are no narratives about someone getting wishes and it working out for them. I mean, in the end, it did kind of work out for Aladdin in the movie. movies. Jillian, the Alithea of the book, does make a go at the wishes that aren't forced by circumstance, primarily as a demonstration of her unambition, by asking for only a little bit of youth. Perhaps the biggest change when it comes to the novella and the movie, however, is Alithea Stories, in that she had them. In the novel, Jillian enters into a dialogue about the nature of love and longing by counterpointing his stories with her own stories because, as you might be able to guess, a narratologist would have a ton of stories of her own. Miller chose to focus on the more fantastic stories of the jinn, and instead had Alithea apply her understanding of narratives to reach into the deeper meaning of the stories that the jinn is telling, and how that shapes his own understanding of the world. In a movie around storytelling that centers around an expert in stories, makes the cutting of stories a little conspicuous. In the movie, Alithea ends up telling her own story as she becomes one of the jinn's stories, a final encounter with love that this time instead ends with his release rather than his prolonged captivity. That is, after she discovers that all the different broadcast waves in a big city are slowly deteriorating the jinn. You guys know the saying, if you love someone and the environment you're living in is slowly killing them, set them free. Like another director that came out in the 70s that would build a massively popular action-adventure franchise in a galaxy far, far away, George Miller is a big believer in the monomyth, or the hero's journey. The Mad Max series itself deals with storytelling and myth-making. Road Warrior is told from the perspective of the feral child who is narrating the time the Road Warrior came to their group. The Mad Max series' loose adherence to canon is down to the idea that Mad Max is a wasteland fable where the reality of Max Rakitansky is not as important as the stories that are told about him. So it's not a mystery why this story about storytelling would speak to Miller. He bought the rights in 1998 and began writing it with Nick Enright, who would succumb to cancer before they could finish. But Enright already had a suggestion for a replacement, Miller's daughter, Augusta Gore, who had graduated from the same performing arts school as Enright. Miller was instantly into the idea and began working on the script with his daughter. One of the big narratives surrounding Mad Max Fury Road was how much of that movie is practical effects, which paints the picture of George Miller as a devotee of the camera and practical effects. Miller is also quick to point out why this might be misleading. The world of Mad Max is built around found objects, and improvising them into other objects lends itself best to creating that world of objects. Miller stresses though, despite the way people talk about the effects, that there is not a single frame of Fury Road that doesn't have a computer generated effect of one kind or another in it, just to get the sky to match, as the movie takes place over 3 days but was filmed over the course of many more. Not to mention having to erase all the tracks in the sand and safety gear on the stunt performers. When you have a filmmaker whose movies range from Witches of Eastwick to Lorenzo's Oil to Babe 2 Pig in the City, the one constant is that he adjusts his methods to serve the movie. He had originally planned to shoot in Turkey, but the pandemic upended everyone's plans. Instead, much of the film had to be shot on sets with green screens that ultimately gave the movie an otherworldly feel. There are plenty of stories to have informed Alithea's suspicion of witch stories, and most of them involve a jinn of one or another. Of course, the most famous is the jinn that helps Aladdin get the attention of his true love, the woman he met briefly and then found out was a princess. But there are other depictions of jinn across the history of film, even if they're mostly just other versions of the Aladdin story. 3,000 Years of Longing evokes the 1940 film The Thief of Baghdad, that is also a variation of the Aladdin story. Like the jinn in the Miller movie, the jinn in The Thief of Baghdad appears out of his bottle at first as enormous and feeling like immediately stomping on the guy who freed him. The jinn's size and giant hand reaching through evokes those images. Every actor has their own way of getting into their role, including an increasingly weird interpretation of method acting. It turns out that it doesn't require that the actor walk around in character and pull weird pranks on their co-stars. In creating the Jinn character, Idris Elba took the no research path. He didn't read the original story, nor did he watch any of the depiction of the Jinn, so as to not cloud his interpretation of the character. As it turns out, artists can be just as much of a fan of someone else as the rest of us. Unlike the rest of us, however, they can meet the person they're a fan of and then strike up a conversation, and maybe that conversation will lead to work in the future. Idris Elba had come across Miller's Witches of Eastwick, featuring Michelle Pfeiffer, Susan Sarandon, Cher, and Jack Nicholson. That movie made Elba want to approach Miller, which he finally did at an award show. Fortunately for Elba, Miller was also a fan of his and wanted to work with the actor. Elba ended up being the first person cast in the movie and a big champion of both it and his filmmaker. Talking about Miller's directing, Elba told Entertainment Weekly he treats every film he's making like it's his first film, like a young budding director wanting to make every frame as good as it can be. He was first in the door, last out the door. Not all director and actor relationships are two-way streets though. There are directors who are particularly singular about how they run their movies and aren't looking for notes. There are other directors who don't have a particularly strong presence on set and just become subservient to the biggest star or most assertive producer. Then there are the directors who are technically competent but don't have much of a discernible style. TV directors generally fall into this category. George Miller obviously does not, and he is a collaborative filmmaker. So when Elba was signed on, he had one request. He wanted to film all the story sequences first so that when he was narrating those stories to Alithea, he would already have lived them. Movies are shot out of order for a number of reasons, usually revolving around location or actor availability. This was as good a reason as any, and Miller was more than happy to agree. Being a story that spans 3,000 years, there's going to be a lot of traveling through languages as well, specifically when the Jinn comes out of his capture having gone in years before the English language. The Jinn picks up things pretty quickly, but there are still calls for the Jinn to speak in Aramaic in some scenes, something that Elba had to learn for the movie. At least it wasn't a feature-length passion play film where they speak in Aramaic the entire time. Like the Jinn in The Thief of Baghdad, Elba's Jinn was first cursed by Solomon 3,000 years back into a world that still contains magic more commonly and openly than in the modern times. The further back the stories were, the deeper and more elaborate the sets became. As we moved forward and magic started to recede, details gave way to cleaner lines and simpler designs. By the time we're in Alithea's world, everything is clean, direct lines and solid colors to reflect the real and the present. The narratives of the Jinn stories are built around some of the more familiar tales from the region that, like any good old story, have been expanded on, contrasted, and reinterpreted. His first stop is King Solomon, specifically his relationship with the Queen of Sheba. It's the latter version of Solomon that we get in the story, and it specifically revolves around the Queen of Sheba. It also has a bit of the Ethiopian story of the pair as well, mostly in that the relationship was not a shot in the dark. In all of these stories though, it is Sheba that is drawn to the immense wealth and wisdom of Solomon, with the Ethiopian version having Solomon impressed with her land as well, because in that story Sheba's land is Ethiopia, and the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba is the origin point of Solomonic rule that lasted for centuries. Ethiopia is a rather significant place for people in general. In the movie, it's Solomon that does the wooing, which includes wooing her away from the Jinn, who would become a Jinn because Solomon didn't want any competition. The Jinn had a pretty rough time from that point on. He's next found by Golton during the reign of Solomon the Magnificent. Golton has her eyes set on Solomon's son, Mustafa. In the movie, Mustafa is paranoid and ends up killing his son, which itself isn't far off. It turns out he was done dirty by Rustem Pasha, who proposed a union between him and Mustafa, but then told Solomon that Mustafa was out to get him. Taking his word for it, Mustafa is killed. In the tellings, his wife is an unnamed Crimean woman who would go on to marry the guy who sent up her last husband because court intrigue is complicated. Golton is killed with Mustafa in the movie before she's able to make her third wish, which would likely be a bit of a doozy. Dutch all-purpose music man Tom Hokenberg, or Junkie XL if you're a fan of his dance and DJ work, has managed to compile a pretty impressive list of credits as a film composer. It includes Man of Steel, Justice League, Deadpool, Tomb Raider, Alita Battle Angel, and notably, Mad Max Fury Road. Miller is definitely not one to go around changing people who he works with. Happy with what Hokenberg did with Fury Road, he tapped the composer for his very un-Fury Road-like script. To help accentuate the theme of love moving through time, the entire score was based on a singular figure that evolved within the story. Miller is so dedicated with working with the same people that he won't let cinematographer John Seale retire. John Seale first worked with Miller on Lorenzo's Oil after working with contemporary Australian director Peter Weir. He shot movies like Gorillas in the Mist, Dead Poets Society, and BMX Bandits. With that impressive career, he felt like it'd be a good time to hang up the camera, and he had done a pretty good job of not working anymore. But then Miller was doing Fury Road, and the scope of the film was too much to resist. He figured that was it, but then realized he kind of missed the smaller films with smaller casts, so he decided that 3,000 Years of Longing would be the perfect cap for his career. 3,000 Years of Longing constitutes 14 years of longing for the filmmaker. He bought out the rights in 1998 and began working on its screenplay with Nick and Wright before starting to work on it with his daughter. In the meantime, the Mad Max movie he didn't think would happen, happened. In 2018, he was finally able to announce plans to make the movie, which would start shooting in 2020. Except 2020 said no. Filming was delayed again until protocols could be put in place. It would be really tricky for a jinn to pop out of a vessel these days and try to get someone to make 3 wishes. We all have our trick wishes or detailed wishes that try to account for all the trickery. It's hard out there for a jinn.